Hey there, I'm Dhillon, and welcome to your AI injection. Today, we've got Ryan Thompson from the CRB Group with us. CRB is a leading provider of sustainable engineering, architecture, construction, and consulting solutions. Ryan's a leader helping guide more traditional businesses in areas like manufacturing and construction into the digital age. Ryan, thanks so much for coming onto the show. Maybe let's get started. Can you tell me a little bit about your typical client and walk me through where they are before you help them and how AI might fit into their future?
Sure. So CRB is an architecture, engineering, construction, and consulting company. We're focused primarily in two verticals. Life sciences manufacturing makes up around 80% of our business, and food and beverage manufacturing makes it about 20%. So we're engaged in both of those verticals. There's a vast area where companies are with their digital maturity, and as a subset of that, AI maturity. I think when you look at manufacturers and in supply chain in general, they're pretty far behind like lots of other industries, retail, banking, marketing, all of that. Like manufacturing is just, I don't want to say late to the party, but they're kind of a more risk averse industry. And especially with life sciences, there's a lot of regulation involved. So people are taking a standoffish approach until FDA comes up with more regulations that can be easier followed. And there's a lot of like nervousness about being first actors with respect to artificial intelligence. That said, I think I see on the life sciences side, our clients are investing a lot in like the drug discovery process. That's something that's pretty standard across the board, but they're not investing as heavily in the manufacturing side. And food and beverage is, I guess, a little bit further behind on their AI journey than life sciences would be.
Maybe we'll just take one of these manufacturers. Maybe let's start with something like the food and beverage side, because it's a little bit less abstract. It's everyone can kind of relate to it, straightforward. So maybe walk us through like what the factory floor maybe looks like, and where data is being gathered typically in this scenario, and where you sort of envision data being gathered in this scenario.
Sure. So I think manufacturing data is kind of in a poor state in general across all verticals, but if we want to stick with food and beverage in general, we see the factory floor is often kind of broken into two major areas. So a process area, and that could be if we want to take a bakery example as a food and beverage manufacturer. So the process area would consist of, equipment that makes dough, adds chocolate chips, puts cookies onto a tray, and then bakes them. And then the packaging area would take the cookies, put them in a tray, put them in a wrapper, seal them, verify the package, and get that off to, Target or Walmart or whomever is buying the products. So where the data exists in a lot of different places. So each of those process and packaging areas will have time series data. Things like, if you look at the process side, temperatures, humidities, pressures, agitator speeds, things like that. On the packaging side, you have a lot more discrete data, how many cookies I'm putting in a package, how efficient my machine is running. And you'll also have kind of excursion type event data. So when something has gone wrong, you'll have discrete events that are tying into that. And that's kind of on the factory floor. But then on top of that, you've got really like your business data. So what product are you making? Who is the end customer? How big is the batch size? How many cookies am I making? What's the due? And you have this kind of metadata that surrounds that. And then you've got that kind of the third level, which is really the consumer level data. So how fast am I selling these cookies? Who's buying them? What does my customer look like? And that's kind of in a separate silo that would be more like a CRM type of, or I guess customer relationship management type of silo. So that's really a challenge with manufacturing is the data exists in so many different silos. So where do you get started with AI? Because looking at any one of those silos individually, although there is some benefits on some of this stuff, the ROI is not necessarily there because the problem you're solving is kind of smaller scale.
Yeah, thanks so much for describing that world. So I'm going to start maybe on the factory floor because it's interestingly different and we get to talk about cookies on a conveyor belt. My first question is, because you mentioned that these are sort of maybe more traditional businesses and tend to be a little slower on the centralization of all the data. So there's not necessarily like a centralized data warehouse that has like everything in it, the way you see with tech companies or software companies, and it's fairly far along. Walk me through, like, what are some of the reasons that didn't happen during the quote, like big data era where everybody was busy instrumenting everything? Like, are there challenges where you have legacy equipment that maybe just doesn't have machinery built in, or data gathering capabilities, or that they don't have network capabilities to get the data off the machines? Or, like, what were some of the challenges that, and where is the state of that, today?
So that state, I guess, varies greatly. I think you hit on a couple of key points. Some of this equipment isn't networkable. So you'll have usually what runs factory floor equipment is something called a programmable logic controller, or a PLC. And those tend to have long lifespans. So you might see some that were put in like the early 2000s or 1990s that still exist today. And so it's difficult to get information from those. So some companies will take like an IoT approach by putting sensors not necessarily directly connected to those control systems and putting them into the cloud and doing something with it, but it's still not then tied into the whole, again, data warehouse infrastructure. And I think the other issue is, like, from a security point of view, a lot of these older systems also have, software requirements that I can't run on anything past Windows 7. And so now how do you connect that to your network in a secure way and get the information you need off of it? And of course, there's ways to do it with firewalls and rules and things like that, but it becomes a lot more complicated of a problem. And IT teams generally are hesitant to put those types of old systems on their network without a really strong reason to do so. So you're left in a world where on those types of systems, you can collect data from them, but it's often like a manual process and it's time consuming. And so it can't really be done at scale well. It can be done to analyze, one problem one time, but that's not really a good use case for AI or even advanced analytics in general. It's more of like just a human looking at data and trying to interpret it.
So what's the kind of state of the market like to address these problems? Is it getting, increasing sensors inside of like more modern machinery and just sort of expecting them to grandfather their way out? Or is it building external sensors, maybe like, cams that like stare at a dial and like automatically interpret the results of the dial, but, have modern Wi-Fi connectivity and, security, et cetera?
I mean, new equipment that's being purchased and produced today, it's all capable. Even anything that's really been produced in the past 10 years is capable, but factories have lifespans that are longer than 10 years. People do absolutely put extra instrumentation. I have seen that use case of a camera not pointed at a dial, but pointed at some other type of device. And that works if you wanted to, but you really have to have a compelling reason why it's not just cheaper to install a separate sensor. If you look at like what we'll call like IoT sensors that will connect directly to like a cloud platform, a temperature sensor might cost you $100 and it might be another, $10 a year in SaaS costs to get data from that. So those types of camera solutions don't often make sense. So we do see clients doing second sets of instrumentation on things that are important to them. What we see this use case a lot, and that's a really well-defined case, is predictive maintenance for motors. So, 100,000 square foot factory might have, 1,000 motors in it. Those could be things like running conveyor belts. It could be things like running mixers in that dough or cookie manufacturing that we talked about. Putting a sensor on them that would measure, the temperature, vibration, and current that a motor is generating. Really cheap, costs, less than 1% of the installed cost on the motor. And predicting failures for motors based on temperature and vibration is a really well-defined machine learning case. And so it can provide a lot of value really quickly with just a separate sensor connected to that. And you do miss some of the concept, some of the context. For instance, mixing dough. Is this recipe a thinner dough or a thicker dough? Does that affect the failure profile of the motor? So you do miss some of that context, but you do know when a device is going to fail and you can adjust your maintenance strategy to address that.
So the fact that you want to be able to predict when a motor is going to fail, I think I'm supposed to read from that the primary driver is to prevent the whole conveyor belt or the whole line from failing. And that was kind of my question, is like, what's the thing that would motivate AI getting onto the floor? And it is that the main driver? Like, make sure it's like maintaining operations, maybe first and foremost, and then maybe optimizing throughput secondly?
Yeah, so I think all these factories generally, they're capital intensive buildings. They need to run 24/7 to make a return on investment. So that's keeping those running is a powerful use case. Optimization is another powerful use case, especially, and this is more in life sciences than in food and beverage, whereas life sciences, the cost of goods are very high. So getting the most out of everything makes a lot of sense. The processes in life sciences are more complicated and they're multivariate. So people can't look at a biological process as look at like temperatures and oxygens and things like that when we're growing cells and predict what's going to happen. Whereas AI platforms or machine learning platforms are much better than that people could ever be. And can also be done at scale. Instead of doing, one process at a time, you can do hundreds or thousands of processes.
Okay. So now tell me what you do with these clients. Now that I think myself and our audience here kind of has the lay of the land. So I'm sort of envisioning, your clients are companies that, are food and beverage companies that have many of the same, probably all of the same things that other companies have. They have sales groups and marketing groups, and they're measuring kind of how well their product is. But then you have this special world where you're physically manufacturing something. And we've talked about that. On the life sciences side, there's a little bit more complication because you have to decide how to commit capital to like a particular drug, which involves a whole R&D phase that's probably fairly extensive. But what's your role as somebody who's trying to like bring these more traditional industries into kind of more state-of-the-art technological applications and AI-driven tools?
So like I said, we see clients in a range of digital maturities. I think the first thing I want to look at is, well, what do you want to do as an organization? And so my role is a consulting role. So what goals do we want to accomplish here? We don't want to have, technology that's in search of a problem. I want to know what business goals do we need to accomplish? Is my factory throughput at maximum and I want to get more throughput out of it? Do I want to reduce my labor costs? Do I want to get products to market faster? Do I want to be able to use equipment to make different products? So, Industry 4.0 is kind of the term we call it with the fourth industrial revolution, where we're taking advantage of like orders of magnitude increases in computing the last, I guess, since Moore's law, right? But we have all this like connectivity and computing power. So how can manufacturing leverage that? And the idea is that it's the fourth industrial revolution. The three before that being, the steam revolution, electricity and mechanization, and then automation would be the previous three. But there's really four benefits for manufacturers. So one is the productivity, getting more product through the plant cheaper. Quality. So what do your rejects look like? In life sciences, cost of quality is very high. So this can actually be the number one driver for people adopting Industry 4.0 technologies. And then you also have speed. So that's time to market. That can be really important in food, for instance, taking advantage of like changes in consumer trends. I always think of it just because there were those projects I was involved in, like getting avocado oil into foods was a huge thing. I don't know if that was like 5 years ago, but marketing.
I didn't even know there was a such thing as avocado oil.
There is you can squeeze an avocado.
I mean, it makes sense that you could, but it's picture the green stuff. So.
Yeah, but it has like health benefits and consumers loved it, right? But if you could be first on the shelf to have, a product made with avocado oil, it made a huge difference to your sales. So that speed to market can be very important. And also in life sciences, if you're the first company to market with a drug for a particular condition, you're going to capture market share that you're never going to relinquish. It makes millions, if not billions of dollars of difference. So that speed can be another important factor. And then finally, flexibility. So that's really the ability to pivot, change what product mix you're making, what your equipment can do. And that one's a little bit more difficult to define, and clients aren't that's usually the one that they'll rank the lowest of those four priorities. So we look at, what does your business want to do? Which of these are important to you? And then we can start having conversations about where you are as a business in your digital maturity. There are a couple of different what we'll call digital plant maturity models, which kind of will gauge on different areas of your business on a scale of 1 to 5, where you are. So those models let you look at, where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. You're really good at, say, scheduling, but your defects are poor. So you're going to get more return on your investment by investing in some sort of quality program that will reduce your defects. The other thing about those models is it lets you kind of track how you do over time. To answer that question, what do you want to gain from digital manufacturing and where are you now? And then we can start figuring out where you want to go.
Perhaps you're not sure whether AI can really transform your business. Maybe you don't know what it means to inject AI into your organization. Maybe you need some help actually building models. Check us out at xionyx.com. That's XYONIX.com. Maybe we can help.
So I'm envisioning, like, you're having a series of conversations. Maybe you're consuming some of the documentation of your clients and you're sort of walking them through. But ultimately, your goal at this stage of your engagement is to figure out what the most bang for the buck problem is that they could focus on. Is that a fair assessment?
That can be a fair assessment. I think some companies, like I like to look at, companies will generally have a vision. Is this a 6-month project? Is it a 3-year project? Is it a 5-year project? So when you start looking at those longer time horizons, it may not be what's the most bang for your buck in the short term. It's more, how do we change the culture of this business to be digital first? I think about, the Amazon's API mandate when they came up, everything is going to be accessible via an API, and that cultural shift.
When they for the sake of our audience, at Amazon, I think it was in the fairly early days, but Bezos put a mandate that every single team in Amazon had to put APIs around their service so that any other team could access their data and use it. I think originally it was sort of internally facing, but then of course it grew into this massive industry of like that we know of AWS at this point.
Right, and that fundamentally changed their business. And I think when you look at manufacturers, they need to do this. They need to fundamentally change the way they're operating. Every manufacturer I've worked with operates in Excel sheets.
Why do you think that is? Why is it that manufacturing is slower to jump on some of these like technology advancement trends?
I don't know how much of it is history, and in the past, sorry, my lighting changed there.
No worries.
So I don't know about how much of it is history and being burned in the past. Like Windows updates used to break manufacturing equipment, so there's been a hesitancy there. There's also been a hesitancy around, I don't know if you're familiar with it, like IT versus OT. So OT is operational technology. So that's really the technology stack that makes your factory work. And there was often kind of incompatibility with the two. And IT people wouldn't support OT systems, and OT systems were always hesitant to IT. And there was like this just cultural rift that was created.
Sorry, what were the OT systems?
Operational technology.
Okay, so this would be like the machines on the floor.
The machines on the floor and the whole technology stack that makes them run. For instance, there's like communication protocols like OPC UA is one of them that nobody in the IT world has ever heard of, but is a huge thing in the OT world. So just the technology stacks are different. And I also think what changed, maybe from like 2005 onward, maybe, was in the past, systems that were operated by the OT group had a very high uptime requirement, 99.9%, and IT systems weren't in that area yet for businesses. So they'd be more, an outage was a huge thing on the factory floor, like we talked about a little bit. But I think now when you look at IT systems versus OT systems, IT systems have got a lot of extra nines, especially when you look at cloud-based systems, AWS, Azure, GCP, whatever. But even private data centers that are run by these big manufacturers, their uptime is much higher. And what I like to kind of guide our clients towards is, if you look at solutions that are built on AWS or Azure, whatever, you have hundreds of millions of people around the world that are using these systems. When you look at the OT technology stack, you have tens or hundreds of thousands of people that are looking at it. So you've got that order of magnitude difference in user base and solutions that are out there and reliability. So I think we want to I kind of guide them to embrace IT solutions because they're built for more reliability than OT systems are now. Like, when was the last time you noticed like Google was down? It just doesn't go down, right?
I mean, I hear you. So one question I have then is like kind of turning a little bit more towards AI, because this is an AI podcast after all. How does that fit in? So you mentioned you go through this process with these manufacturers and you identify sort of some of the key problems or areas that they want to focus in. We've also talked a lot about the data gathering challenges that happen in the operational context and, of course, there are other challenges in the other context as well. But like, what drives AI into one of these places? Is it AI that's pulling in more sensors and more data to like feed better models? Or is it the other way around, where there's just a lot of sensors and models and data, and executives are asking, like, what can we do with all this investment we've made in gathering this data?
I think it goes more from the executive push, especially, we start looking at like 2022 onward when, ChatGPT became popular culture, and AI became a topic of Fortune 500 companies in their earnings reports, as well as you'll see consulting people talking with C-suite saying, you got to do AI, you got to do AI, you got to do AI. But there is a bit of a disconnect between, what's going on at the executive level and what actually exists on the factory floor. So I mentioned earlier that some of the use cases that we're tackling in silos, they're great. We talk about predicting motors are going to fail. There's a strong use case for defect detection using vision AI, whether that's a cloud-based service or an edge service if it's a high-speed application. Those are great use cases, save a ton of money. There's a lot of return on investment there. But I think what we're really striving towards is a more holistic view of, how does your whole factory operate? Predicting, like being able to use data from all those levels, from the factory floor, from business systems, from consumers, and give suggestions to people on how to better operate the manufacturing floor. Because I think that's where we're going to get the most long-term gains, where we have systems that are supervising our management level really to optimize the output of a factory.
Let's break that down a little bit, because I'm not sure I'm following you there. So maybe we imagine the factory of the future here, where every machine is fully instrumented. All of that data is being gathered and centralized. All of the selling data, the data of the product and how it kind of comes to be. Maybe even there's cameras around for the humans that are moving and looking at efficiencies there. So all of that raw data exists. What does it mean to like move the business forward? Is it a sort of a leap of faith that, hey, we're going to throw a bunch of data scientists, have them start stack ranking the problems by severity, and then maybe trying to assess the feasibility of a machine learning solution, and then go off and prototype now that we have this sort of data continuously being gathered? Is it something like that? Or is it more top down, like, well, we actually know there are particular problems in particular areas, and we're going to go selectively gather data and try to address those? Or is it something else that
Yeah, I think it's more the first one, where we spent time and investment on instrumenting things, making sure we've got our data contextualized and organized in a way that AI can ingest it, and then we can start looking at having your data science teams really look at things. I think that's something else that is an opportunity for manufacturers too, is often they don't have data science teams. Data science teams might be focused on process development, but they're not, traditional data scientists. So I think that's another opportunity too. I think in the areas where we know there are problems, it may or may not be an opportunity for artificial intelligence. The example I like to give, we talked about life sciences. So and biological processes. So what we'll call a bioreactor, which is really a tank where we grow cells to make medicines. Those processes are very tricky to optimize. We know by increasing those processes by 1%, 2%, 3%, that can make a difference of millions of dollars for companies across an organization. But where we are mostly now are doing kind of proof of concept types of projects. So analyzing one bioreactor, well, that's great, exciting, might benefit the scale of one bioreactor. But what if we have 1,000 across our organization? How do we model our data like that? So there are a couple of known problems where AI can have a direct impact, because those problems are just very difficult for humans to solve it, and for humans to solve at scale.
Well, so one question I have is, like, putting the data science on the shelf for a moment, is there a tradition in these arenas of having like efficiency teams or some kind of Tiger team that goes in and tries to solve particular problems, like the throughput of, the cookie optimization problem or something? Like, is there a notion of that? And
yeah, absolutely.
Maybe how do they operate? Like, maybe you can give us a little insight there.
So continuous improvement is a big portion of manufacturing. Kind of Toyota made that famous in automotive, but it applies to other industries as well. I think what we see a lot of right now is Six Sigma or Lean Six Sigma, which are programs developed to make data-driven decisions, very specific processes to follow, but it's really looking at problems in an analytical way to solve them. If we looked at that kind of panacea system where we have all the equipment on the factory floor instrumented and we have all of our data connected, I think AI can help point us towards problems to solve as well. I think that's a really compelling use case. Hey, this isn't right. And then you bring in that continuous improvement team to go look at those particular problems.
What's the, like, let's say you have a continuous improvement team, they study a problem, they come up with recommendations. What's the typical mechanism for affecting change on the floor in the operation structure? Like, is it they present a case to some senior execs and then somebody pulls a lever? Like, is that
that's generally right. Exactly. They would make a recommendation. We'd put together a project that would, we have to have these actions, whether that's more instruments or we need to write code or we need to install something, and then project would get executed and then you would reconcile the results after you executed it.
So those executives, when they see that set of recommendations, inevitably the recommendations are going to cost some money, take some resources. Are they looking, like, what's the level of data support for the recommendations typically, and is it observational or is there actual measured experimental data that they're using to make those cases?
It can be both, but I think most of the time there is data. The types of continuous improvement activities would be, we're currently making 100 cookies per minute. If we make these improvements, we will make 110 cookies per minute, which means this machine needs to run X hours less per year, which is going to save us this much labor and this much utility cost. So it's usually very tactical and concrete like that.
Just thinking out loud here, I mean, it feels like in this factory of the future, so it seems like as an exec of one of these manufacturing facilities, you make a concerted investment in instrumenting and gathering data, which a consultant like you helps them get to that point to make that investment. Once you have that data, then you hire some data scientists, but maybe you embed them on these efficiency teams. So they're going through with the team. They're helping make the case a little bit clearer. Like, why do you think exactly that it's going to go from 100 cookies per minute to 110? Oh, well, we have this statistical model that took all these variables into account, and we've been able to generate past training data across the variations in those variables, and now we can sort of stand on something a little bit more solid. I mean, that feels like a route. Is that legit?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. So I think when we look at some of these Six Sigma teams, like I have a Six Sigma green belt, for instance, but I would never call myself a data scientist. I can fit models, like usually regression analysis and bell curves and things like that, but they don't have the rigor of dealing with, large data sets and designing experiments and things like that. But absolutely having data scientists support continuous improvement teams would be a huge advantage. Agreed.
Yeah, I mean, even like let's take the cookies per minute idea. So, you have some measure of how many cookies are coming out per minute. You have a bunch of variables that you're tracking over time. So now you have a curve of cookies per minute, maybe run in different contexts, late at night, early in the morning. Stuff happened, kind of like a natural experiment that's like happening all the time. So now you build a model to predict those cookies per minute, and now you can go back and start torquing some of those variables that you think you could actually affect. I don't know, turning on some fan or whatever those variables are. That seems quite promising, and then you could leverage the machine learning or AI systems to go backwards and build explainability into them, so you can sort of reverse engineer why you think you're going to get from 100 to 110, but specifically from the variables and their values and their sort of interconnectedness. Something like that you're thinking of?
Absolutely. I think what I really liked where you said there was the natural experiment piece. I think that's, when you start looking at design of experiments, now you start purposefully tweaking things and making measurements. So you do have some of that one observer effect, which who knows what you're changing just because you're actually running a real experiment. But it's also it's difficult to manage from an operational point of view, because now you want, instead of my normal production schedule, now I've got to have my engineering team come in. They're going to tweak this recipe, but maybe we didn't finish our batch on time and they're kind of causing more headaches and interference. Whereas if you're able to run a natural experiment, which now I'm making hundreds of batches of something a year, you get a lot more data and can really see what those variables affect. And then the other thing is you remove a lot of the human bias out of it too, where it's like, you might have a process engineer that it's convinced, oh, it's this one pressure variable, we need to change the pressure and it's going to optimize the process. Whereas an AI algorithm doesn't have those biases. It will just look at everything holistically and make recommendations.
Well, it has other biases, but yeah.
Fair. There's
But
less
yeah,
when
I
you're
mean,
looking at.
that's kind of what I was, when you were explaining the sort of classical technique of these sort of efficiency teams, I mean, putting myself in the shoes of the exec, I just feel like I would be wanting them to prove to me that this is going to be the case. And it seems like the more data you have to make that case, and not just the more data, but like the more effectively you can make that case with data, I guess.
At Xionyx, we're experts in transforming your complex data into actionable insights. Whether it's through natural language processing, computer vision, or predictive analytics, we tailor AI solutions to bring innovation to your organization and make your products much more powerful. Don't let your data overwhelm you. Discover more at xionyx.com. That's XYONIX.com.
So there seems like there's something else. So we talked about the natural experiment side, but it seems like there's the slightly unnatural experiment that you could do as well. Maybe you get the factory after hours or on certain weekends or something, and you can muck around with variables, stick a few more people in the catch the cookie falling off the conveyor belt location, certain things like that, where you can start to capture a little bit more data. It feels like one of the challenges here with these kinds of systems is being able to get enough spread across the variables to really, in these other contexts, to be able to figure out what's actually going to work. Because in the natural context, maybe you just don't muck with the pressure variable very much. Like it just stays within a certain bound. But you wouldn't know if you let it swing high or low that it actually can make a big difference. So you'd have to.
The more diverse your product portfolio is, the better you're going to do with those natural experiments. Like you might have some processes that naturally will run at say, 80 Fahrenheit, and some that will naturally run at 60, and you get that variation there. And cookie A might be different from cookie B in that parameter for whatever reason. But you're right, and in a well-controlled process, your parameters may not be varying that much, and you don't get it. Like you might get noise that is wrong, like by temperature being off by 0.1 degree. Is that really affecting anything, or is that just noise? So I guess, just like I said, the more diverse your portfolio is, the better you're going to get those natural experiments. The tricky part is with the onesie twosies, where you have access to the machine to do what we'll call engineering runs. You don't get to do enough of those where AI can make a good assessment of the cause of those variables. It's more a traditional design of experiment. I tweaked this value from A to B, and these were my results. You don't get to train it on 10, 100, 1,000 sets of data where it can really be more sure of the cause and effect.
Makes sense. Yeah. And I imagine there's other very different applications as well of AI, where you are putting in your own sensors and maybe have a more niche or tailored computer vision problem. Like, I don't know, boxes flying down a conveyor belt line. They're all supposed to have 6 parts in them. These are the 6 parts that are supposed to be in them. Camera shoots them. You count them. Did you get all 6 parts? Yes, no.
Computer vision is a huge opportunity. I think, this is something I talked about in a webinar a couple of days ago, but, in the past where, I'd be sitting in programming camera and saying, how do I tell a difference between an S and a 5? Well, I've got to tell it, an S has this many pixels in this direction and this many pixels in another direction, and a 5 is totally different. And so I spend, hundreds of hours programming cameras saying this is what it's supposed to look like, and it's very not robust. And you might have, your ink changes on something that you're printing, and now all of a sudden an S looks like a 5 to the camera. Using AI to do something like that is super fast, quick, easy. And I mentioned earlier, you can either do that if it's a slow operation. You can leverage cloud tools with $100 camera. If it's a fast, a lot of these applications we're talking about, like sub-seconds between parts, you'll need some sort of edge compute to do that. But it's a super easy use case. In a previous life, I had a customer that was shipping products to Walmart. Mm-hmm. And they would get dinged because their labeling on the secondary packaging couldn't be scanned. Putting in a camera system solved that. Using an AI-based camera system reduces your engineering costs by 50%, really, really easy use case, really easy to implement. And again, when I talked earlier about having hundreds of millions of people that use cloud tools versus tens or hundreds of thousands that use OT types of tools. So you get these use cases that are already well developed. Like there's really no programming involved at all. Like, can AWS read this barcode? Yes or no? And you're done.
So you mentioned, going back to something you said a few minutes ago, you mentioned that these executives in these manufacturing facilities are sort of really aware of, GPT, and based on that, they're sort of more open and pushing down some of these AI capabilities into the manufacturing centers. Walk me through a little bit more of that. Are we talking about the chat capabilities and the natural language conversations that you can have? Are we talking more about the generative imagery stuff? And if it's the natural language stuff, what are they thinking? Is it like customer support, customer experience, technical support stuff? Is it internal use cases to like transfer knowledge efficiently, amongst employees? Like what kind of stuff are you seeing there?
So I think the natural language is really exciting. I think pharmaceutical manufacturers specifically use that for drug discovery. So that's, I said, I think on the top of the podcast, that's where they're investing a lot of money, trying to figure out what the next molecule looks like. And that's like when we start looking at, okay, let's look at all the research that's out there for drug discovery. Humans can't stay on top of everything. It's just too vast. Natural language processing is a great tool for going over tens of thousands of research papers, lab papers, putting that all together, and then giving some recommendations. Hey, we think this is these are the priorities. And then you have really smart people. Part of that will be a data scientist, but part of that will be like, PhD scientists. Hey, how will this molecule affect this function of the body? So like that is really well-defined research, and the companies are investing heavily in there, because for life sciences manufacturers, R&D is a big cost center. But if we're going to make innovations, we need to continually invest, and AI is a huge tool helping that.
Yeah, that's a big one. In fact, I mean, we were building deep NLP solutions like this for biopharm back in the late 90s. And back then it was really hard to do some of this stuff. So we were doing like grammatical parsings of text. Think seventh grade grammar students armed with really large dictionaries, so that you could say like, this particular gene inhibits the expression of this particular gene, in the mouse model or whatever. But now, of course, with LLMs, like, oh my gosh, the stuff we were dreaming about is all like pretty well realized.
It's always tough, like going back 10 years and looking at like how hard you worked at something, and going back now is like, I could do that.
In a
few hours. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if we were going to solve it the right way, we would have had to invent, deep neural nets and LLMs, like, which a lot of evolution that had to happen. We were building these heavy dependency tree parsers that were largely rule-based, but, statistics too. But yeah. And then on the other side, not in the pharmaceutical arena, but in the food and beverage side, what is the role of LLMs on that side, do you think?
Food is more like a consumer-facing good, so you do see like the typical use case of chatbots and things like that. But even handling like customer complaints in a more consistent way. You think about like every box of food that you buy has a 1-800 number to call for complaints, but being able to handle those using AI and tying that back to manufacturing data. So I know that this box of cookies was made on this date, and then you can kind of tie back the manufacturing data there, so you can start building those as you get more and more customer complaints, because people never call to compliment the cookies. They only call us if something's gone wrong, right?
So you want to see if there was actually something going on.
You can get trends. You can get trends a lot better, right? Being able to tie customer complaints to specific manufacturing lots, but even if you're not tying it to manufacturing lots, being able to just monitor customer complaints against SKUs or locations can be a huge benefit. And it's also like a time-consuming task that people don't like doing. Imagine if you're the person that's responsible for reviewing this Excel list every week of all the complaints that you got.
That's how they do it.
No, I can't say that for sure, but that's certainly a way. And especially if you're a smaller company, you got an Excel sheet that's tracking these complaints. It's not an enjoyable job, and you're not going to spot trends as well as a computer will. The other thing, I think, from like learning language models is more kind of on a marketing side, I talked about earlier, but like the avocado oil fad, but seeing what consumer trends are by monitoring, what's going on the internet in general, or whatever, Reddit or Facebook or whatever popular tools are out there where people are talking about, oh, I just tried this new habanero snack. Habanero is going to peak in popularity, so we need to be ready with our version of that. So that kind of marketing and product planning piece is another huge area, because it's impossible for people to monitor all of the information that's out there, and AI is just a much better tool at it.
Funny that you mentioned that. We used to, this was decades ago in a prior life, but we were working for, I think it was General Mills or one of the big food companies, and they were looking at flavor predictions at that time. This would have been early 2000s, I think. And so we were mining all this blog content to figure out what the next big flavor was going to be. We spent like tons of time and energy, and then we said it's going to be pomegranate. And they were like, pomegranate? Why would you say that? And I'm like, check it out. Here's the data. And then sure enough, like I think it was 6 months later, pomegranate was everywhere, like everywhere, every fruit drink, everything, and they were super excited about it. But I that is a huge thing.
I love that story, but it's a use case that companies are continually to invest in, and again, that using
cool
large language models.
That people are still doing that. Yeah, I mean that was a great use case, and they were so excited when we showed them all the data behind pomegranate. I don't know if they went off to invest in it or not. I have no idea, but it was. But they appreciated the methodology and stuff. So,
but like having the right flavor at the right time, it's millions of dollars.
And same thing for clothing too. Like that, like trend prediction is a big deal, because you got to ramp all this physical machinery and supply chain and everything to be able to produce the thing at volume. If you can be out 2 months in advance, then you're the ones that everybody's buying from. When the thing takes off.
If you remember, like at the start of the pandemic, if you remember, like the Truly peak, right? Like everybody was buying that. They were coming out with all sorts of new flavors.
The hand stuff or whatever. You mean?
No, the Truly, the alcoholic seltzers.
Oh, okay.
There was a big peak in that market, like start of the pandemic, kind of spring, summer 2020.
I didn't know that.
It went huge. Companies retooled their factories to make more seltzers, and then 8 months later, the market died because people don't love them as much as they used to. It went back to normal, but there was a ton of capital and investment spent there. But I don't know how much of that you couldn't really have predicted that. That's not just the nature of the pandemic being kind of unexpected and once in 100-year type of event.
Very few things proved forecasters wrong more than COVID. So this has been a super fun conversation, and I feel like I've learned a ton about this space. I want to ask you a question. So a lot of our listeners are, product managers, or, are basically folks trying to understand how to use AI in their business, in their product, in their processes. What can you say to them as far as maybe speak to folks that you can imagine in the industries that you're talking about, but could be more general than that? But, what do you think they should do? How should they get involved? Like, what are some good starting points? Some tips or something?
So I think, like I said, manufacturing is kind of a mess on the factory floor. So software that makes it easier to organize your information and present it in a way that can be ingested by these types of systems is a big deal. So right now, like even if I do have a piece of equipment that is instrumented, it's still hard to get that data into Azure, for instance. It's a time-consuming process. So having that kind of direct connectivity into those cloud ecosystems, I think is going to be really helpful. I have seen too, a couple of products that I don't know what they use, but they make their own kind of niche AI type of software that, is like an on-premises type of solution. But I think the most important thing is understanding the state of data on the factory floor, how it's structured, and making it easier to de-silo it and connect it with business and consumer information as well. I think is what the missing link is right now for manufacturers, and to really leverage artificial intelligence.
So it's kind of like get your data warehouse populated.
I agreed. I think that's
because everything all the fancy stuff we've talked about, all the prerequisites for all of it is that you actually have some data. Ideally, you've instrumented the heck out of your factory, and you can now go and start to realize some of these predictions, whether it's cookies per minute or or what have you.
Exactly.
Great. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show. I'll end with one last final question. Let's fast forward. This is my favorite question to end on. So my listeners are probably like, yep, I know what's coming. So 5 to 10 years out, if everything that you think or want to happen or are regularly recommending happen, what does like a state-of-the-art manufacturing facility look like?
All right. Well, 5 to 10 years is so hard because I couldn't have imagined where we'd be. If I take a step back 5 or 10 years from now, I wouldn't have predicted where we are now. So I like to think that things will be self-optimizing. And optimize is a tricky word. What does that mean? What's being optimized? But you should know when, if we're designing factories digitally, so we have, digital twins of tanks and packaging lines, the facility should be able to set all of the parameters it needs to set, operate all of the equipment it needs to operate, and predict what that factory is going to be doing, 1 minute, 5 minutes, an hour, a day into the future. So you really have kind of a complete digital, almost like an end-to-end supply chain. So when you've got raw materials coming in, what you're shipping out. You always know the instantaneous state of the factory, and you're able to predict with a high degree of accuracy what the future state is. And of course, the further in the future you're predicting, the less accurate that prediction is going to be. But right now, I think we're in a state where we kind of sort of know the instantaneous state of the factory, and our predictions are not great.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming on.
That's all for this episode of your AI Injection. As always, thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode and want to know more about implementing machine learning in your company, you can check out a related podcast episode of ours by Googling Xionics Product Management. Also, please feel free to tell your friends about us, give us a review, and check out our past episodes at podcast.xionics.com. That's podcast.xyonix.com.